Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Late yesterday, I canceled a carefully planned operation which was underway in Iran to position our rescue team for a later withdrawal of American hostages.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda.
Those are a few of the defining moments in American history from the past 60 years. And while they are all different, there is one room that connects them all. It might look like a series of nondescript conference rooms tucked away in the White House basement, but for decades it has been where presidents have dealt with the most pressing crises for the United States. It is simply called the Situation Room. George Stephanopoulos held various roles in the Clinton administration. You'll also know him as the co-host of Good Morning America and the host of This Week on ABC Television. And his new book is The Situation Room, the inside story of presidents in crisis. George, hello.
Matt, good to be with you. How are you today?
Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. For a lot of people, I think and you mentioned this in the book, the only idea that they might have of the Situation Room is from Dr. Strangelove and the War Room, which apparently you can't fight in. What exactly is the Situation Room?
The Situation Room is the nerve center of the White House. It's actually now a complex of rooms in the basement of the White House, right next to the White House mess, where you have a series of duty officers who track everything going on in the world 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so they can communicate any updates to the president and his top staff. They also are the people who facilitate the president's communications with the rest of the world. But even more than that, the Situation Room, the main conference room, the Situation Room, it's now called the John F. Kennedy Conference Room, is the place where the president and his top advisors deliberate on the most consequential national security decisions and reach those decisions.
This is a relatively new thing. What were the events that led to the creation of the Situation Room?
It wasn't created until 1961. You know, the other American presidents had managed wars out of various rooms in the White House, famously Franklin Roosevelt in the map room on the first floor of the residence. Of course, Abraham Lincoln went to the telegraph office to get his updates on the war, but there was never a permanent watch center or nerve center in the White House until John F. Kennedy became president, and he actually created the room right after the Bay of Pigs fiasco in 1969. He was just livid. He was angry at the CIA. He was angry at the Joint Chiefs. He thought they had misled him and given him bad information about the invasion plan, and he was determined to have his own information flow coming into the White House because he believed that information, rightfully, was power. So right after the Bay of Pigs, he set it up. It was built very quickly, $30,000 in 2 weeks. And for the first couple of years, there was just a single watch officer who would work a 24-hour shift and then take 2 days off, be replaced by another one. That's now all changed in recent years, but that was the genesis. Interestingly, Kennedy actually had a paper on his desk recommending creation of the Situation Room from a larger-than-life figure named Godfrey McHugh, who was his military aide 2 weeks before the Bay of Pigs. And Godfrey McHugh is one of these people who you almost can't believe his story when you hear it. He was an Air Force general. He actually spoke American English with a French accent because he grew up in Paris. He dined with Winston Churchill and FDR as a teenager in the White House. He went on Harry Truman's yacht. He even dated Jackie Kennedy before John F. Kennedy married her, and he was very close aide to John F. Kennedy. We think he was the first person ever to use the term Situation Room. He forwarded that paper to Kennedy 2 weeks before the Bay of Pigs. Immediately after the failed mission, Kennedy implemented it.
We played at the beginning of our conversation some moments in history where that room has played a part. Give us an example of, to you, one that stands out and illustrates how this room works at its very best.
I think the room worked at its very best in the run-up to President Obama's decision to take out Osama bin Laden. For months, a very small group would meet in the confines of the Situation Room with no phones, no communications to the outside world. They couldn't even take notes on the possible mission, and they were able to keep it secret for over 6 months of planning in that room. And over that period of time, the top decision makers also reached a high level of trust in each other, which you had to have for a mission like this. I think the other thing that marks that entire mission is that everyone in it, from especially Admiral William McRaven, who was the leader of the Navy SEAL mission, to people like Robert Gates, who was the president's Secretary of Defense at the time, and several of his other top advisors, had all gone to school on the failed Iran rescue mission under President Jimmy Carter during the hostage crisis in 1980. And they had learned so much from that disaster in the desert, and they put those lessons to work in the successful mission to take out Osama bin Laden. They also stress tested every possible idea and every possible mission as they led up to the final decision. But even then, this was a very close call. In the end, there was only about a 40 to 60% certainty that this gentleman that had been identified in the Abbottabad complex, they called him the Pacer, was indeed Osama bin Laden. They had to make a call based on imperfect information. President Obama basically said, this is a 50-50 call. Had they been wrong, had it not been Osama bin Laden, it would have been a great embarrassment. And one of the reasons in the end, they insisted on doing a takeout mission rather than leveling the place with a bomb or a drone, is they wanted to have that DNA evidence so they could convince the world that indeed got Osama bin Laden, and in fact they did.
Pete Souza, who was the White House photographer, took that photo, the Situation Room. Can you just describe, because in some ways that was the first glimpse that people got into everything that you just described, but also into that room itself. And it's just a room full of people like crammed into this tiny space.
Yeah, and that's actually the ante room just off the Situation Room. It's not the main conference room. It was there because they had set up the initial communication link with Admiral McRaven's team in that ante room, which is literally just off the actual White House Situation Room, conference room. But when the senior officials started to clock that someone could actually see what was going on in the other room, they all drifted into the ante room, including President Obama himself. The man who had set up the communications, Gary Bresnahan, actually was asked by Tom Donilon, the national security advisor, hey, why don't we move this all into the real room? And he told what he said was the only white lie he told in his time of government service. He told Tom Donilon, I just can't do it. He probably could have done it, but he was so afraid if they made any kind of a tweak, they might lose the communications line. So he said it just wasn't worth the risk, which is a good thing because we did get what is now the most iconic photo ever taken in the Situation Room complex. And it was a good thing for Gary Bresnahan as well, because he was situated just outside the door. So he got the first fist bump from President Obama after the successful mission.
What do you see in that photo?
I'm trying to figure out the exact moment. Pete Souza isn't entirely sure. He thinks it's towards the end of the mission. In my mind, I imagine a different moment, which I now know it isn't. To me, it looks like it could have been the moment when, at the beginning of the mission, one of the helicopters did indeed go down.
Because everybody in the photo looks incredibly stressed.
Everybody looks, well, they are stressed. And that's why I like to imagine that moment, because if you imagine the moment where you have the hard landing of the helicopter, everybody in that room is thinking, oh my gosh, is this happening again? Is this Jimmy Carter's failed mission that's going to cripple Obama's presidency again? Indeed, it wasn't. But the actual moment was probably slightly less dramatic. Pete Souza is fairly sure, but not positive, that it's just in the final moments when the crew is trying to evacuate from the complex, and they're just holding on for those last few seconds to see if the crew gets out.
I want to play you something from a moment where perhaps the Situation Room didn't provide perhaps the best advice to the president. Have a listen to this.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
What role did the Situation Room play in that moment from Ronald Reagan?
They were the naysayers. top to bottom.
So it's true that line, that what became a defining line toward the end of the existence of the Berlin Wall and the Cold War.
Line,
He almost didn't say it?
Well, he was going to say it, but boy, they didn't want him to. Secretary of State George Shultz didn't want him to. Colin Powell did not want him to. The ambassador to Germany did not want him to. His Russia experts did not want him to. They thought he was going to put Gorbachev into a corner. There was no way, it turns out, that Ronald Reagan was not going to say it. But every single time, and I had a great interview with the speechwriter, Peter Robinson, single time Peter Robinson went into the Oval Office, Reagan said he loved the line. Every single time he left the Oval Office, the other advisors, and this happened up until the day of the speech itself, they were doing everything they could to get that line out of the speech. So this is one of those instances where the gut instincts of Ronald Reagan developed over decades of public speaking and communicating to the world overrode the collected wisdom and the collected experience inside that situation room.
One of the things that you mentioned this, I mean, people are there 24/7. If something happens overnight, how do you decide when to wake the president up?
That is their call, and it's not an easy one. We have a whole sidebar in the book where they all talk about when you do it, when you don't. And every president's a little bit different. Some presidents and some of their top advisors only want to be woken up if the information is verified and it's 1,000% sure that you have to wake them up in the middle of the night. Others, like President Clinton, would be more angry if they weren't called, even if it did turn out to be a false alarm. But it's one of the first things that the duty officers have to learn to deal with, and it actually creates a fair amount of stress for them. But they get pretty good at it. What is parapsychology? And how did that make its way into the Situation Room? Strangest story I came upon. Parapsychology is kind of it's ESP, the study of ESP, the study of remote viewing. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, there actually was a program in the U.S. government called Operation Grill Flame, where they were spending tens of millions of dollars a year on psychics, on having people who would go into dark rooms, close their eyes, and imagine events happening all over the world. On May 8th, 1980, Jimmy Carter called in his naval aide, Jake Stewart, to give him a briefing on Operation Grill Flame. Interestingly, the First Lady, Rosalind Carter, was there as well. This is one of the only meetings we could find, if not the only one, where a First Lady participated in a policy meeting in the Situation Room, because she was a great believer in the paranormal and parapsychology. She was a devotee of Uri Geller. Remember the guy used to say spoonbender? Yes. By the way, he also made a fortune getting hired by mining companies who said they used his extrasensory perception to help determine where mineral deposits were. Take that for what it's worth. Anyway, President Carter calls in Jake Stewart, listens for 45 minutes to a briefing on the successes, Stewart said, of this Operation Grill Flame, doesn't say a word. At the end of 45 minutes, he simply takes out a White House notepad, writes one word on a piece of paper: hostages. He was desperate. This was 2 weeks after the failed mission in the desert. He was desperate for any information that helped him locate the hostages who had been dispersed. Eventually, according to Stewart, they were able to help locate one of the hostages, a man named Richard Queen, who was suffering from multiple sclerosis. And they were able to extract him before the end of the Carter presidency. But of course, all of the other hostages were not released until after Ronald Reagan became president of the United States. It's an amazing story. Why did the book is filled with stories like that? Why did you want to write it now? For me, it was a way to tell the story of these duty officers who have served. They come from every single part of the government. DOD, State Department, CIA, DIA, every military branch, and they are the best of the best. And they are rigorously apolitical. They are there to serve the presidency, not the president. And for me, it was also a great opportunity to tell their story. And part of the reason, and I can't say this was my intention going in, but was what I learned as I was doing the reporting. It became a real tonic and a real inspiration for me, because it was a way for me to tell the story of people who are often derided, had been derided in the last several years as part of the deep state. And, the big thing I learned as I was researching and writing this book is that America's deep state is packed with patriots who are doing their best to serve their country every single day, to serve the presidency to the best of their ability, and to have the chance to tell their stories and share their stories was one of the great blessings of doing this book.
You say the book is a look at crisis management in the modern presidency, and during the Trump administration, the president was the crisis to be managed. What happened in the Situation Room on January 6th?
Most horrifying story in the book, to me. I found the White House duty officer who was serving, the Situation Room duty officer who was serving on January 6th, a man named Mike Stiegler. He was not eager to speak with me at first. But after months of communication, he finally decided to tell his story, and it's a chilling one. We know the outlines of what happened on January 6th today, the riots. But what Mike Stiegler on that day was the man who was the point person between the White House Situation Room and the Secret Service on Capitol Hill, trying to protect the Vice President of the United States from these rioters. And one of the things that Mike Stiegler told me is that no one understands how close we came to losing the vice president. In those moments, the people in the White House Situation Room, including Stiegler, had to implement what is called the continuity of government policies for the United States. These were the series of policies set up by Dwight Eisenhower at the height of the Cold War, designed to make sure the United States government survived a nuclear attack, separate chains of command, dealing with the evacuation of high-level officials so they could function outside of the White House. On that day, they were starting to implement those procedures. Can you imagine what it felt like to be inside the Situation Room on that day? This is the room where they have dealt with the assassination of a president, the attempted assassination of another president, the horrors of 9/11, where they've managed the longest war in American history. Obviously, the takedown of Osama bin Laden. They've dealt with all kinds of crises and natural disasters. Never before had they been called upon to deal with an insurrection against the United States government inspired by the President of the United States himself, who was sitting upstairs just off the Oval Office watching the proceedings on TV, sipping Diet Coke, and never called down once to the White House Situation Room, which is, to me, one of the most chilling stories you can possibly imagine.
This book arrives, of course, in the advance months before another matchup, presumably between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. As you look at this election, given what you've just said, what do you think is at stake?
American democracy. We've had a 250-year experiment. It's worked. The fundamental, the bedrock of why it has worked is because we have believed in the peaceful transfer of power. That was rejected in 2020. It continues to be rejected today. Donald Trump continues to lie about the last election. Every single time he speaks, he calls those who rioted on January 6th hostages and warriors and promises to pardon them. He refuses to say that he will accept the results of the next election. The stakes could not be higher in this election because it is not a normal American election. It is one where our democracy itself is on the ballot.
Let me just ask you a couple of questions about your day job and how you cover something like this. You said that airing a live interview or doing a live interview with Donald Trump, in your words, is journalistic malpractice.
It is.
Why do you say that?
Because I mean, this is documented, and I know that when I speak like this, it risks looking partisan, but it's not partisan. It's simply defending facts and truth and civil debate. So much of what he says, and that's part of his technique, are lies, and that he sort of blusters through them. And in a live interview, no matter how skilled or well prepared a moderator is, there is no way they can prevent those lies from going out into the ether and infecting the body politic. We've seen it happen. 70% of the Republican Party now believes the 2020 election was stolen. It couldn't be further from the truth.
So how do you cover him then? How do you go about telling the story of somebody who still has a huge constituency of voters who will support him and could very well be the next president of the United States?
I mean, so that means you have to cover him It means always keeping the most important issues in perspective. For example, the former president had a big rally in Las Vegas over the weekend, where he said for the first time, he called the January 6th rioters warriors. That was the first time he said that. It suggested they were set up by the police. To me, that should be the headline of covering what the president said that day, because it's the most important issue we're facing. So many of our journalistic outlets, I mean, they all covered it in a slightly different way, but so many instead said, led with, the president comes out against taxing the tips of service workers. Now, in any other world, when a president does that and goes to, or a former president does that and goes to Las Vegas in a normal policy debate between two parties, I could understand that, but not against the backdrop of one of the candidates being someone who is refusing to accept the last election. That's the most fundamental fact of this election. We can't treat it like it's just another debate over tax policy or economic policy or environmental policy.
How should we talk about age, do you think? Joe Biden's 81, Donald Trump's in his late 70s, and there's been a firestorm of criticism from people who say that the media should not focus on, that this is not an issue. And yet you'll talk to people, Americans, and you'll talk to pollsters who are speaking with Americans, and they'll say that age is a huge issue.
Of course it is, and it is an issue. I don't think we should shy away from covering it. We should cover it in an even-handed way. We should say what it should be about is how age affects judgment and stability. And I think we should make sure that we like I said, do it in an even-handed way. No question, in part because, in a way to appear being even-handed, whenever Joe Biden stumbles, we in the media tend to make a relatively big deal about it. Again, going back to this weekend, where former President Trump was doing a rally where his teleprompter went down and delivered 45 to 50 minutes of what appeared to be incoherent ramblings
about
sharks and electric boats and batteries. And the question I have for people is when a speech like that is given, and that was given very scant attention until 2 or 3 days afterwards, is what would we do with that speech if President Biden gave it? We should just hold the candidates to the same standard on that question. I don't think it's an illegitimate issue by any means. People are concerned about it. They have a right to ask questions about it. We have the responsibility to report on it, but we must do it in a fair way.
Let me just ask you a couple of quick things before I let you go. One is, what do you make of the rise in popularity such as it is for RFK Jr.? Post-pandemic, and this is about third-party candidates, but it's also just about him in particular. What do you make of that?
I think it's a few different things. One, it's the name right there, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., number one. Number two, people are unhappy with the choice. He's not that much younger, but he certainly is younger. Number three, and the Canadian writer Naomi Klein wrote a great book about this year on conspiracy theories in the modern world. It was about her doppelganger, Naomi, but it turned out to be about a lot more than that. But I do think he touches on something that she wrote about in places in her book, where the conspiracy theories where right and left kind of come together. Particularly around things like COVID, I think he embodies that as well. So it can draw from both sides.
You recently said that the first question you hope is asked in the upcoming presidential debate is who won the last election. If you go back to what you write about in the book and the crises that presidents face, how worried are you come January 2025 that history might repeat itself?
Quite worried. I'm hoping not. We'll see what happens. I'm hoping that we have a peaceful election, a clear election, and one that both sides accept. I'm not terribly optimistic right now.
That's a really sobering thing to say.
It's what I believe. It's going to be a long 6 months.
It sure is. I'm really glad to talk to you. This is a fascinating book, but also the perspective you have on what's happening right now is really interesting as well. Thanks again.
I appreciate it. Take care.
George Stephanopoulos is co-host of Good Morning America on ABC. His new book is The Situation Room, the inside story of presidents in crisis.